This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 451, entitled Campus Gender Wars. Biconscious Masculist Undergrads Attacking Monoconscious Feminazi Gender Studies Professors. Description. This flyer envisages confrontations on campus between biconscious masculist undergrads and monoconscious feminazi gender studies professors. Probably the gender studies professors will demand that their university presidents ban the presence of the masculist undergrads from their courses. What happens after that will depend on the strength of the masculist lobby on campus. In all likelihood, there will be a lot of bitter verbal blood spilt in these campus gender wars. Flyer itself. Biconscious masculist undergrads attack monoconscious feminazi gender studies professors. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. I'm debating with myself whether the campuses or workplaces will be the scene of the real gender political bloodletting as biconscious masculists attack monoconscious feminists. There are obviously many more workplaces than campuses, so that fact is in favour of workplaces being the initial battlegrounds. But I consider it likely that the level of monoconscious, ignorant, that is, of masculist ideas, opposition will come from the university professors of gender studies for several reasons. One is that these gender studies professors know a ton of feminism, since that is their livelihood. They are paid by the university to teach feminist ideas, so are extremely monoconsciously biased. They are very familiar with the ways that men oppress women, but know nothing about masculist ideas, so know nothing about how women oppress men, and certainly nothing about the idea that in fact women oppress men far worse than vice versa, due to women's decades-lasting manslaving parasitism of men. This flyer predicts what is going to happen when angry biconscious masculist male undergrads start talking about masculist ideas in the gender studies courses they attend. I'm predicting these verbal confrontations will be bloody, in the sense that there will be considerable passion and hatred on both sides. The gender studies, in brackets, aka women's studies, professors will see the ideas coming from the biconscious masculist undergrads as just more male chauvinism, more male abuse of women, and hence will react with real hostility. The biconscious masculist undergrads will see these monoconscious gender studies professors as typical monoconscious feminazi bigots, that's MFBs, and will yell at these professors for their ignorance and callousness towards men, not giving a shit about what the fluffy feminist hypocrites are doing to men in the divorce courts, financially crucifying and destroying the lives of one father in 4. There will be real passion and hatred on both sides, to the point that gender wars will explode on campuses. I can imagine that the gender studies professors will complain to their university presidents to ban the presence of masculists from their classes. This attempt will be met by delegations of masculists pointing out to these presidents the sheer hypocrisy of the monoconscious feminist demands, telling the university presidents that in reality so-called gender studies is a euphemism for women's studies, and that in reality there are 2 genders, and that men's issues are not even addressed in these gender studies courses, despite the fact that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. These young masculists will give these university presidents a crash course in masculinist ideas, probably delivered in the form of well-prepared sound bites for only a few minutes to have maximum impact on the presidents, who will be as ignorant of masculinist ideas as their monoconscious feminazi gender studies professors. But at least the presidents will be more open-minded than the gender studies professors, and probably quite a bit brighter, so will be more amenable to listening to what the young masculists have to say. Probably the young masculists will tell these presidents that, quote, "Women oppress men far worse than vice versa. That rape is small beer in comparison with women's, with fluffies, decades-lasting, man-slaving parasitism. That women have a career window of half a century, so have to fib up." That's become FIPS equals financially independent persons. Or be severely punished by men by not getting one, forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at for being a man-slaving, fluffy parasite. End quote. These young masculists will tell the presidents that 80% of young women at the critical age of 16 choose to become fluffy crappers, choosing fluffy crap majors that will give them fluffy crap diplomas that the economy doesn't value, so that in their 30s these fluffy crappers will realise that they can't afford to pay for their own middle class house to raise their kids in, so will look around for some gullible, stupid, ignorant, man-slavable man to pay for her to live in that middle class house that he pays for. A decade later, she will probably divorce him, take him to the hated, fluffy, feminist, hypocrite-dominated divorce court system, and rip away his kids from him, take his house, half his wealth, half his stuff, forced to pay child payments to his kids he will barely see, and if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat, parasitic ass and flip up, so that she parasites off him after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. These young masculists will tell the presidents that the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites, in brackets, who want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men in sharing out the burden of earning the living by bothering to get a career-competent education at high school and college, so that they are FIPS as adults and not expect to parasite off the money and labour of some gullible, unmasculisted manslave, close brackets, behave as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts. Thus these fluffy feminists want their cake and to eat it too. They are feminists in the parliaments, but fluffies in the divorce courts. Hence, in the eyes of the masculists, fluffy feminist hypocrites. These divorce courts have been made so toxic for men by the hated monoconscious fluffy feminists that these feminists have become indirect genociders, since in many countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. That is, they live the MGTOW, that's men going their own way, lifestyle, thus crashing the birth rate. But these millions of young MGTOWs are merely reacting to the awful toxicity of the divorce courts taken over by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites. The young masculists can then insist to the presidents that gender studies be just that is, a study of the genders, that is, both genders, female and male. The masculists can insist that both women's and men's gender issues be taught in these gender studies courses, or that there also be gender studies courses for men, that professors be hired to teach masculinist ideas to men, in brackets, and women if they want to attend. Hopefully, the university presidents will be quick-minded enough to take in rapidly the main ideas of the Masculinist undergrads and see the sense in what they are saying, and then act appropriately, seeing that gender oppression is definitely not a one-way street, and that the masculists have a real point when they tell the presidents that the feminist gender studies professors are monoconscious, that is, have only had their feminist consciousness raised, and know nothing about masculinist ideas, that is, know nothing about how women oppress men. If the presidents agree with the demands of the Masculists, then that will be a victory for the Masculists, a step towards the liberation of men, that is, the very definition of Masculism. But if a university president is rather cowardly and takes the easy way out by giving the gender studies monoconscious feminazi professors what they want, that is, the banning of the Masculists from the gender studies courses, then the Masculists can organise a mass crashing of these courses, showing the presidents that there is real anger and hatred coming from the Masculists against the utter hypocrisy of so-called gender studies that do not even mention men's issues, let alone the fact that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. The Masculists can organise a university-wide publicity campaign pointing out the hypocrisy of one-sex gender studies courses and write articles on Masculist ideas in the campus newspapers or blogs, etc. The Masculists can also go to their local media in their city and stir up controversy in the media, giving themselves a platform to spread Masculist ideas, not only in their university, but to the public as a whole. I can imagine that the temperature in the early discussions, that is, mud-slinging matches, between the monoconscious feminazi gender studies professors and the young biconscious masculists will be bloody. The gender studies professors will be less intelligent than the smartest of the young masculists, since it's likely that the early masculists will be the smartest of the undergrads. Also, the gender studies professors have been brainwashed for 60 years that gender oppression is a one-way street. They have read hundreds of feminist books about how men oppress women, so they are not going to take kindly to a bunch of snotty-nosed male masculist undergrads trying to force them into a gender political paradigm shift that preaches that not only do women oppress men, that is, that gender oppression is a two-way street, but that these masculist undergrads have the effrontery to claim that women oppress men far worse than vice versa. Most of these gender studies professors will be too closed-minded and not mentally agile enough to absorb quickly the masculist main ideas, and hence will reject them as ridiculous, then run to the presidents of their universities to have the masculists banned from their feminist courses. What then happens will depend on the strength of the counter-reaction of the masculist undergrads on campus. If large numbers of them are outraged by the hypocrisy of what the gender studies professors are doing, that is, being closed-minded to the claims of the masculists, then there may be a tidal wave of masculist protest on campus that the presidents of universities have no way of ignoring if they want to keep their jobs. My final question is, how long will the above scenario take to become reality? ? Masculist and MGTOW ideas are spreading rapidly, so within a few years, probably most male undergrads will have heard of them and be familiar with the strongest of them. For example, that marriage and paternity are toxic for men, so choose not to give young women their sperm. That fluffies are manslaving vermin to be forced to rot on the shelf. That 80% of young women choose to become fluffy crappers. That women have the MARA, that's maternity rejection right, but men don't have the PARA, paternity rejection right, the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, etc. Increasingly, masculist and MGTOW books are being written. The mainstream media has still not really taken up the masculist message, largely because the majority of journalists now are female, who are as monoconscious as the gender studies professors, so are equally brainwashed that gender oppression is a one-way street. So the masculists will need to overcome this monoconscious bias on the part of the feminists and feminist journalists. The gender studies professors will be forced into cognitive dissonance by the masculist undergrads. The more closed-minded these professors are, the more the brighter young masculists will harangue them with real male verbal aggression, telling these professors that they are indirect genociders, callous towards the suffering that fluffies cause men, financially massacring one father in 4, stripping him of his kids, a war issue in the eyes of the masculists. There will be real gender wars on campuses as the masculinist message penetrates the minds of both sexes. There'll be a lot of metaphorical blood spilt as masculinist rage builds up until we see the historical equivalent of the Stonewall riots of 1969, when New York's gays rioted against the local police for their bigotry towards gays. Today's gender studies professors are certainly biased towards masculinist ideas, with their deeply ingrained attitudes that gender oppression is a one-way street and that it is women who are the oppressed, not men. For a monoconscious feminist to suddenly become biconscious after hearing a masculinist harangue her for only a few minutes is highly unlikely. Most will simply close ranks and close their minds, thus making the task of the men-fairing of the gender laws and changing public attitudes towards the ideas of the masculists all the harder. It's thus likely that the temperature of the gender wars to come will just keep rising, that things will get worse before they get better. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 450 plus masculinist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.